And it's actually with all this technology that's being implemented, but how do you make sure you don't do that culture disrupt or have that subculture coming into the organization?
It's probably a series of podcasts as well.
Do you think AI is going to be the next big shift, like what we had in COVID?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The question is, what does it mean for organisations? What does it mean for individuals? Also, what does it mean for societies, both nationally and globally?
Welcome back to Raw AI Solutions, the podcast where we explore how business leaders are navigating the fast-moving world of AI and digital transformation. My name is Denise Powell, and today we are joined by Tim Connolly, CEO of AptumX. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Denise. Pleasure to be here.
Tim, would you like to kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. So my background is consulting. I spent most of my career in change management consulting. I was with KPMG way back. Came out of there in 1994. A colleague and I set up a consulting firm focusing on change management, really the business end of technology and structural driven change. So a lot of work with ERP systems and things like that, but very much helping the business prepare for the change rather than the technology. And ended up running two consulting firms in that space over the next 20 years or so. Went independent in about 2012, 2013. Did a few interim CEO roles, some independent consulting. And then about 5 years ago, I got introduced to a company in New Zealand called Exol, who have a software package that basically is a business modeling and automation tool that as soon as I learned about it and got to know the people who ran it, I realized that this was a technology that I had to have something to do with because it addresses a lot of the issues that I've seen technology failing to address in the world of change over the whole of my career, really. So we're at the moment in the process. We've had a couple of hiccups on the way, not least when the founder of the company died a couple of years ago, which slowed us down a little bit. But we're in the process of raising finance to acquire them and bring that software to the market. We're already doing some work in the UK. And AptumX will be the vehicle by which we help organisations not just to implement that software, but to actually run their business better as a result of having a full understanding of how their business operates, touching all the areas that ERP systems, for instance, don't touch, and using that as a basis on complete understanding to be able to automate and also to make full use of AI, which is going to be a big focus for us. Because if you ask a system, if you ask an AI system to advise ways in which you could run your business better and you're giving it inaccurate data about how you operate, you're going to get serious garbage out to reflect the garbage that's gone in. So that's going to be a big area for us as we go forward. So we're just really on the launch pad at the moment. So we've done a bit of work in the UK, but we're going to be ramping things up as soon as our investment is finalised, and hoping to have lots of conversations about this with lots of people who we can work with.
Wow. That sounds like something the market really needs. But how are you going to get the data to? Because not many companies have got data in a good state.
No, I think data is an issue. I think visibility of how the organisation really works is an issue. I won't go into the detail now because we'll be here all hour, and I know we've got other things to talk about. But to a large extent, we can cleanse the data that's relevant to what you need to know in order to be able to run the business. And I think that's the key. There's so much data that you have to be able to be selective about what you're using. And I think our software is very good at helping organisations to do that, to use the data sparingly and intelligently.
Wow. I'm excited to know more about that because I've got all these questions thinking about how much data do you need? How many years do you need to go back on that data to be accurate?
We can have that conversation, but that's probably another one to have. So.
Exactly. Well, in today's podcast, we'll be exploring why transformation leaders are rethinking how they are measuring progress and how companies are shifting from box ticking to real impact. So Tim, you've been working with organizations that have been through some major transformational cycles, but where do you typically see the biggest disconnect between what's being reported and what is actually moving the scale?
I think things have been shifting over the length of my career, which goes back quite a long time now. But I think the big shift, in the early days of my career, everything was so finance data driven. And, I mean, when I was at KPMG, I left there in 1994. And in the latter years there, we got heavily involved in Balanced Scorecard with Bob Kaplan and Norton, David Norton. And we actually acquired Norton's consultancy and we partnered with Kaplan. And Balanced Scorecard at the time, and it's still quite widely used, was quite a revolutionary shift from using financial indicators to taking the financial indicators as the kind of top of the tree and then beginning to drill out into people indicators and internal business process indicators and customer satisfaction or customer attitude and customer behavior. And that was a big step forward. But even that, in a way, the limitation, the shortcoming was in the word scorecard, because it was a scorecard and it was capturing information at a point in time. And I think the big shift over the last 30 years, and probably much more recently than that, for all sorts of reasons which we can explore, is away from a series of moment in time snapshots to being able to actually understand what's going on in the organization. Maybe not in real time, although with greater use of automation that will come. But having a more balanced, to use that word, a more balanced understanding of what's happening, and for that information to be much more regularly updated and some of it to be continuous than was the case at the beginning. So I think, there's probably two main themes there: the shift away from finance or building on finance. Of course, financial indicators are important, is the first one, and the shift away from point in time to more ongoing data is the other. There's lots of subplots behind that which we can explore, because as the range of data that's become available which has obviously exploded over that period of time, as that's changed, then you can measure things and you can use data that you just literally couldn't do 30 years ago. So I think that's probably the big trends. I think that probably a lot of people, a lot of practitioners have been frustrated for a long time. I don't think the issue has been lack of enlightenment or desire amongst people to look at things in a different way. But as always, the system and the infrastructure takes time to get to catch up with the needs and the capabilities that exist.
Absolutely. One thing I found with transformation, especially on reporting and real-time reporting versus a point-in-time reporting, the higher up it gets, the longer it takes to get there. So by the time you have the important people looking at it to make those key decisions,
It's not so real time.
it's already like a month out of date. And you think, well, we've moved on from that issue, we found a workaround.
Well, I think in part that goes back, or large part that goes back to still having, old-fashioned ways of processing modern data. Because what you described is this sort of natural. I mean, I'm actually by origin, before I became a consultant, I qualified as an accountant, and there's still a bit of the accountant in me. And what you describe is the sort of natural funneling up, the consolidation up of information, and almost by definition, most of it starts at the bottom and makes its way out to the top. And so again, I think another part of the shift is saying it doesn't have to be like that. Actually, decisions and strategies come from the top, and the flow of data, to an extent, not all of it, because it depends what you're trying to measure and what you're trying to do with it, but some data needs to start at the top, not at the bottom. And that's probably another big shift that has got quite a long way to go yet, I think.
Absolutely, especially when businesses are moving towards the trend of being data driven, making those data decisions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you've helped simplify complex programs, but how do you help executive teams separate the signal from the noise when there's so much happening across people, processes, and tech?
I think a number of things. I think there's quite a big piece around what, looking at any particular senior team and saying what's really driving you, what do you most need to know. And there's some data, there's some information that everybody needs, but I think quite a lot of it is driven by personal preference, by the nature of the industry that organizations are in, by what happen to be their issues at any point in time. And I think that's an important thing, because as issues change, priorities change as well. And I think it links back to the last point that we discussed, i.e. about starting at the top and looking down. If you can get people recognizing that there is a better way to understand how their organization is working, then you've got a conversation. You're off. You're kind of off to the races. And I mean, this podcast clearly isn't about particularly publicizing what we do, but we do it for a reason, and a big part of that reason is that in order for any of that data at the top level to be useful, it's got to link back to what's actually happening on the ground. So you've got to have a proper connect. It's not the sort of financial consolidation, but a sort of logical connection between what you need to see in order to run the business and what's actually going on in the business, not just in terms of data, but in terms of the processes that produce the data. Because, I'm always a bit inclined to say we talk a lot about data, but data without process and activity is actually pretty meaningless, because it's the things that happen in an organization that give any life to that data. So you have to have a connection between the two.
So if you had to pick one between data, people, processes, or tools, which one would you say is the most important?
I look very inhuman if I didn't say people. So let's leave people out of it, if we may, because I think that does sort of hang over, sort of go over the whole thing. So the way I would, if you take process, technology, and data, I think the best way to look at it is a kind of triangle that you can flip around, but I would put process at the top of that triangle. And it's pretty much for the reason that I just said, that without process, without something happening, data is kind of meaningless. Data is only useful because you are doing something with it, or you're producing it, and in order to produce it, you've got to do something. And technology is an enabler, a very big enabler, and sometimes a blocker, by the way, but we can come back to that, to the way that you use process and data to get the outcomes you want. So, I would, if you took any one of the nodes of that triangle away, the whole thing would fall over. And therefore, it's quite a high bar to say which one's the most important, but I would put process at the top of the triangle. That's the way I'd put it.
You spoke earlier now about technology can sometimes be a blocker. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and it's probably one of the things, or it is one of the things that got me most excited about the technology we're working with. Clearly, technology has driven huge amounts of benefit and change, not just over the last 10 or 20 years, but over the last 250 years, ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So technology is a major driver of change. But, you go and talk to anybody who has tried to use an ERP system, for example, or probably various other enterprise software packages, and have gone to that system or gone to the IT department and said, we're changing the way we operate, or we want to do something slightly different. And it's going to take 9 months to test it, and it's going to take another 3 months to put the change through, by which time you want to do something different. So I think so that's one part. The other part is that ERP systems typically only touch up to, say, 50% of what's actually happening in the organization. So sometimes technology is a blocker by its absence, by there not being the technology in place to enable you to make the changes you want to. So I suppose it all describes a mismatch between, the phrase I quite often use is changing at the speed of business. And, as the world changes, the speed at which organizations have to change, the speed at which strategies have to be rethought and implemented, all of that is much, much higher speed, much higher velocity than it was even 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30. So it's the failure of technology to keep up with that pace of change that I mean by technology being a blocker as well as an enabler.
And I think there's been one massive shift. We were speaking about it earlier, about when COVID hit, there was a massive shift in how quickly we get tech enabled, as opposed to how we've always been doing it.
Well, I'll do this story because I shared it with you offline, and I think it is quite an interesting one. And when COVID happened, I was probably a bit bored at some point, but I did my own informal research project, just getting out. Clearly, I wasn't getting out, but getting on calls with as many people as I could who were in reasonably senior positions in quite a wide range of organisations, and saying, how have you coped with the whole shift to home working and so on. And there were a number of very interesting themes, some of which I think are well worth revisiting. But the one that really stuck with me was talking to someone who's been a client, who's a good friend, and he was in a senior technology role in a large retailer at the time. And of course, being a retailer, they had to carry on. They're one of the big grocery chains, and they were still operating. But they moved all their non-retail staff, all their office staff, they moved to virtual working very quickly because they had to. And I spoke to him probably about July, so probably about 3-4 months after lockdown had happened. And I said, well, how do you do it? And he said, sheer need. He said, if somebody had come along in normal times and said, we've got this great idea, we're going to close our corporate offices, everyone's going to work from home, we're going to have to put the technology in place, we're going to have the right security around laptops that are operating out of people's homes, wherever they may be. We're going to set up, Zoom and whatever else we need to have in place. He said we'd have spent a year doing a feasibility study, another year assessing it, and then decide we couldn't do it. But he said, in reality, we did it in about 2 weeks because we had to. And I think, it's extreme. Obviously, COVID generated some extremes. But I think, when you now stand back from that, one thing that was obvious at the time was that technology to an extent, but people in particular, and maybe this is why I think people sit above the triangle that we talked about just now, when the chips were down, and it was often uncomfortable, and for some people it was worse than uncomfortable, it was catastrophic, but when the chips were down, people changed and they operated in different ways. And, that you have debates like the hybrid model and the home versus office working and so on. That's far more developed, I think, in 2025 than it would have been if we hadn't all gone through what we went through 5 years ago. And that's just one example. I think a lot of people learnt a lot of interesting things about how they work best, how their teams work best. And I think the other thing, we touched on automation, that several people said to me, even back then in the summer of 2020, in order to make that shift to home working even possible, they had to rethink how they did a lot of things. That was part of what they did, maybe not in 2 weeks, but in the short period of time after that, once people were established at home and their laptops were working. And I think what it showed was that when you started looking at a lot of business processes in ways that quite a lot of organizations hadn't done in a systemic way, they saw a lot of quite surprising things in terms of waste and duplication and just things that could be done better. And B, they saw things that genuinely could be done better by machines. Not necessarily, interestingly, to the point that it meant that they needed fewer people. Sometimes that was true. But equally, it was identifying ways in which they could use the human beings more productively, in more valuable roles, probably more satisfying roles as well. And that was another thing that was becoming very obvious very quickly when COVID struck.
Do you think AI is going to be the next big shift, like what we had in COVID?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The question is, what does it mean? What does it mean for organizations? What does it mean for individuals? But also, what does it mean for societies, both nationally and globally? And we better not do all of that. But I think if you just think about it a little bit from both an organization's point of view and from an individual's point of view, I just touched on, the fact that clearly as AI's capabilities become clearer and as they develop, the phrase I quite often use is, what is it that is done in an organization that is uniquely human? And the definition of uniquely human is always changing. It changed when the spinning jenny was introduced in the late 18th century. It changed when electricity became widespread. It changed when we began to digitalize with personal computers 30, 40 years ago, and so on. But that's changing not just what computers can do better than us, but it's also changing and opening up new possibilities for things that human beings can do that weren't possible. If 20 years ago, even maybe 10 years ago, you'd talk to people about data scientists, they would have given you a rather strange look, whereas now everybody recruits data scientists. But we don't have too many people, going around London putting out the streetlights anymore, because that job disappeared when electricity came and you didn't have candlelight anymore. So, at one level, it's just a natural progression. I think from a company's point of view, you can't bury your head in the sand about AI if you don't if you don't ask yourself questions, and I think it's really important to ask them in the right way, which I'll come back to in a second. But if you don't ask yourself questions about A, whether you can do what you do better, or B, whether there's something else you should be doing that you don't do at the moment, then somebody else will ask those questions for you. And I think maybe the really important point there is a couple of books I've read recently that brought this out really well for me. It's don't think about what AI can do in terms of it doing what humans can do, but better. Think of it in terms of what a technology, let's take AI, but it doesn't have to be AI, can do. AI is not just a sort of superhuman. AI is no matter what people say. AI bots can't think, but they can do things that we can't do. Some of it's just thanks to brute computing power. Some of it's thanks to its ability, the ability to make connections that a human probably could make, but it would take us longer than we've got to live to make the connections. Whereas AI can do it like that. So AI can do things that we just can't do. But it's not just doing what we do better, it's doing things differently. And as it does those things differently, that creates new possibilities for how you run your business processes. It may create new possibilities for products and services, and it creates new possibilities for how people can work. And that takes you on, I suppose, to the, how do each of us, no matter who we are, no matter what our role in an organization or self-employed or whatever, how do we adapt? How do we respond to it? And, I think we respond to it in the same way as you do to any change. And that is to say, I mustn't be driven by what I grew up thinking was the right way to, do things and get a job. I mean, for people in, say, my children, I've got 4 children in their 20s, and they have to look at the job market in a totally different way from, say, my generation when we were coming out of university 40 odd years ago. And I think the key is being able to recognize that and thinking about how you work in a different way. And again, that's not going to work for everybody. There'll be winners and losers, but you're much more likely to win if you've got that openness to the change that's going on around you, and you don't allow yourself to be constrained by, what your parents' generation did, or what you see, even saw people 5 or 10 years older than you doing, because the world is changing, and sometimes the sort of well-trodden paths take longer to change than you've got time to actually make the change for yourself. So I think being aware, no matter where you are in your career, coming out of university or right up at the other end of your career, or coming into the job market at the age of 18 or whatever, it's about just being able to recognise what that working environment looks like today, and to say what's right for me and what skills do I need to develop and continue to develop. And I know it's easy to say, but I think it's more important now probably than at any time in my working life.
And I think in the past you could say we're building to future-proof this organization, but IT is changing so quickly with your career and with future-proofing. Does it even exist anymore, future-proofing?
So yeah, I mean, I think we mean something different when we talk about future-proofing now than we would have done in previous times, and by that I mean, and I'm probably oversimplifying to make a point, but by that I mean, probably in the past you could say, and I've witnessed and even taken part in strategy sessions that said, let's think of the 10 worst things that could happen to us, or 10 best things that could happen. But you were doing scenarios. You were saying, in order, if this scenario arose, what would we do? A bit like when what's now called machine learning and AI came into place. Actually, what expert systems were doing was they were writing a very complex script that for something that would happen. Well, you don't do AI like that anymore. It's much more responding to a particular situation. And I think future-proofing and generally strategy has taken the same direction, rather than saying, let's think about our 10 biggest threats and our 10 biggest opportunities, is looking at more systemically. I don't just mean in terms of computer systems. I mean in terms of the whole systemic approach to how your organization works, and say, regardless of what the threat is, do we have the wherewithal to deal with it? And that means things like, people thinking in a certain way, interacting together in a certain way, having access to data, knowing how to use that data, things like that. But it's a shift from a particular type of specific threat to being able to deal with threats. It's from a specific opportunity to being able to exploit opportunities. And we haven't touched on culture yet. A big part of that is culture. That's about having an environment in which creating an environment, which I think is a really key phrase for any leader. Your job is to create an environment in your organization. It's creating an environment in which people are able to think reasonably laterally about issues and to do something with that thinking, and to feel that they're actually able to, to make changes or to achieve responses or whatever it might be as a result of doing that thinking, and not just assuming the world's going to carry on being a slightly different version of what we've got today, because we all know that that isn't the case now, and it's certainly never going to be the case in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually, with all this technology that's being implemented, how do you keep culture, or even should it remain the same? But how do you make sure you don't do that culture disrupt or have that culture, subculture coming into the organization?
It's probably a series of podcasts as well, but I think at the high level, I think at the core of that is, what do you mean by culture? And to me, culture, I think probably there's a reasonable sporting analogy here. So I'm still reading from watching the England ladies last night, and there's all the emotions are going through that. But I think they're quite a good example of a football team, a sports team, who I think there's a clear culture in terms of the way that they're managed and the environment that the coach has created over the last 8 years. I think it is she's been there, but they also have to take a lot of responsibility on the field to deal with situations. And in the course of the 120 minutes plus penalties of the match against Sweden last night, there were a lot of different situations. And, you could see some players in particular really stepping up to that and demonstrating some leadership and feeling like they had the permission to do that. And I think that's really what culture has to be about in any environment. It's not having to wait to be told what to do, but it's also understanding the sort of the parameters in which you're operating. And I suppose also having the emotional and maybe political intelligence to be able to figure out, when you want to do something, how do I make this happen? How do I make this happen in this particular organisation? Who do I need to take with me? All the obvious stuff in a way, but I think the faster that the world is changing and the more uncertain it is, again, in a way, it's the same point as we've been discussing. I think you have to shift from, there are a number of different scenarios, and one of these will probably be right, to however we think the future is going to be, it's not what we think it's going to be. And therefore, we've got to equip people, and culture is absolutely key to this. We've got to equip people to kind of have the tools and the wherewithal, and to an extent be recruiting the people with the right mindset. If you get that wrong, then everything else is kind of doomed from the start. But if you've got those components in place, I won't say the culture will take care of itself, but it's far more likely to thrive. And, if I think back to our first organization, I mean, we ended up with about 100 consultants working for us. We were much more interested in the person and kind of what sort of person they were and whether they would fit culturally than their technical skills. Not because technical skills weren't important, but it was kind of like, they're probably okay, and if they're not, we'll soon find out. And if they're not, then nobody's going to die in the meantime. But if we brought in somebody, you didn't need many hires. In fact, probably one would have been too many, that felt out of line in cultural terms, damage the culture of the whole organisation. And equally, conversely, positively, as long as you had that right environment, I know, and we had surveys done and got feedback that absolutely confirmed this. We know we created a great culture in that organisation because we gave people, I think we got a good balance between, this is the direction the organisation's taking, this is what's important to us, not so much in terms of revenue targets and profit margins, but direction of travel and how we engage with our clients and things like that. And that meant if we hired the right people, then they kind of knew, not necessarily knew what to do, but they knew, they understood the parameters in which they were trying to work, and we could engage in conversations between us to come up with the right answers. And again, going back to your first question, why did I leave people out of that triangle? Because it's more important. If everything else had been average and the people had been fantastic, then we'd probably still have made it work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so if progress is often measured by delivery timelines and task completion, but how do you help companies think beyond delivery to true transformational outcomes?
I think I think it goes with some of the trends that we talked about earlier in this conversation. In fact, probably everything we talked about. I think that that shift that we started with from backward-looking financial measures really dominating what happened, how an organisation measured its success, to an environment today where there's loads of data and there's lots of things that you can measure. And the challenge is more, how do you make sure that you keep what you measure controllable, manageable in terms of volume, that you actually have, you can actually do something with it. I think that becomes really important. But the balance, to use that word again, the balance has shifted quite a lot. And I think the other thing that's important is that, a lot of data that just didn't exist, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, that you couldn't use to measure any sort of progress does now. So I was thinking before we came onto this call about a good example. And a good one for me would be what's called sentiment analysis. So I can remember the first time that I met somebody from a company that did sentiment analysis, and it was about 20 years ago. I think it was about 2006, and it sounded really cool. And they were going to, go into what very basic. I'm not sure it was called social media in those days, but what very basic sources of chat there were in an organisation, an organisation and outside, and they were going to capture key phrases and so on. It all sounded quite cool, but when you think of it, compared with what you could do now, it was really, really basic. And I think now, I mean, I still think some ways that people measure sentiment analysis and use it is still a little bit basic, but there's far more capability now because there's more data, because you've got the cloud, and I think artificial intelligence it'll be a really good feeding ground for artificial intelligence, because a good chat GPT or similar tool would be able to do a lot with seeing what with picking up themes from conversations on chats or customer feedback pages, whatever it may be, and there's lots of it. And you can use it. Not only can you use it, but you've got you've got more data you can actually refer to, that you can do something with. So, and that's just one example that struck me. And there are lots of things like that which just were not possible 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. And I think the bigger point around that, and I mentioned earlier, I don't think that the constraint has ever been the lack of desire of people in management roles, in program management roles, transformation leader roles. I don't think the issue has ever particularly been a lack of desire to do things better and differently. It was just the frustration at both the tools and the raw materials that they had to work with. I'm not saying I think everyone does it perfectly, because that's not true either. And I think there's probably a lot of training and development and experience gathering that most people have to do in order to really figure out the best way to use this sort of data. But it is a possibility now in a way it never has been before. So taking it back to your question, how you measure progress, say around a transformation program, I think you can now have a much greater alignment between the the real the real objectives of, say, a transformation program, and your ability to firstly measure progress against those objectives, but more importantly, to use the data you're getting to change the way you're going to do things in the future. Because I think that's another big shift. Performance measurement used to mean how did we do. Now it's much more now about how can we improve what we're going to do in the future. I'm oversimplifying to make a point, but I think that is a clear direction of travel. And I think I hope the other thing that will follow from all of that, I mean, a big thing for me is that, there's been a tendency for years and years, decades and decades, for change, transformation to be packaged up in a program. We're implementing a new SAP system, so we need to carry out some change. We're setting up a shared service center, so we need to do some change. Change is a business as usual competence. Change happens every day in an organization. I mean, again, one of the reasons I got excited by the software that I'm now working with is that because it enables you to affect changes so quickly, it actually reinforces that sense of change as a business as usual competence. But what that means is that things that historically were being done as big transformation programs increasingly can happen, as smaller packages of work that don't take very long, some of them just out of people's day-to-day activities. And that has an impact clearly on how you measure success, because it isn't all necessarily wrapped up under a transformation leader. And so, the way that people are viewing change, the way that people and technology are interacting, and the way that interaction is having an impact on day-to-day operations, I think we're just at the start of what can happen in that environment.
I'm excited to see what the future holds here. What role do you think emerging technology like AI should play in tracking, reporting, or even accelerating transformation? And where does it risk actually getting in the way?
Well, I think let me kind of do that in reverse order, because I think where it risks getting in the way is probably the key bit. I think where it risks getting in the way is A, the two things are connected. A, when it's wrong, when it's inaccurate, and B, when you don't have the mechanisms, the mindset, culture in place to recognise that it's wrong. So I think and that will take me a little bit back to the first part of your question. AI if you give AI good data, it will be able to come up with some really good recommendations, not instructions, about how you might change a business process, about how you might look at a new market, about how you might change the way you deliver services to a particular cohort of customers, anything like that. They're only recommendations, and the fact that they've come out of an AI doesn't mean they're right. In fact, you could argue it's more likely to mean they're wrong, but it gives human beings something to work with. And, I think one of the biggest shifts that we humans will continue to have to make with AI is the shift from, I've got an idea, I'm going to develop it, and then we'll play around with it and see what it looks like, to somebody else has had the idea, actually isn't somebody else, it's a machine. So we've got something to work with, which I personally think is great, because, for a lot of us work better building on ideas rather than necessarily having them. But I've got to be all over it. I've got to be really, really careful. Firstly, that it hasn't misinterpreted something in the data that it's been analysing to come up with an answer that's basically inaccurate or unworkable in some way. And secondly, to stand back and say, but this is, it may be an AI, but this is only one point of view, and we humans might be able to come up with something much better. But we've got something to work with. I think that's potentially a very powerful way of accelerating and improving the quality of change, so long as the quality of projects and nothing like that, so long as humans we don't abrogate our responsibilities. And to me, that's quite a good example of how AI will make it possible for us to do things in a different way, because a lot of the work in, researching data, for example, to support a particular idea, you can get the AI to do that, as long as you're intelligent in the way that you assess what it gives you. Then you can focus on the really interesting bit, which is what can we do with this information, and AI can help with that, but it's only an input to the outcome.
With the amount of AI that we bring into organizations, especially in transformation, how do you get sustained adoption after go live? What are the levers that you've seen that goes, okay, this is not going to be adopted versus this is going to be adopted?
Well, I think in terms of AI, I don't think I've seen that yet, but because I think it's just, certainly in my environment, it's probably just too early. But generically, I mean, I suppose two things. One is, you'll reap what you sow. So if you do some of the things that we've been sitting here saying that everyone should do, if we're right, then you'll get some good outcomes. And if you do get good outcomes, then engagement becomes much easier. You will always have, and we haven't touched yet on the lurking question of, is AI going to take my job? And at one level, we probably shouldn't go too far down that road, because we'll be here for weeks. But I think there is an element of, if you see AI actually, in a way, this bit is a bit like having a new human member of your team. If you see that person achieving something useful, you're more likely to engage with it. I mean, I wouldn't take that too far because I do think it's really important. We don't think of AI as something, as I said earlier, that can do what we humans do, only better or quicker. But I think in terms of the human interaction with AI, and you could argue that's true of any system. If you implement any system, people are a bit resistant, and then they find that actually some of those really horrible jobs they had to do in the past they don't have to do anymore, or they're able to get information that they don't have to go back and check or feed into a spreadsheet and make sure it adds up. Things like that are quite good ways of getting engaged. So I think those principles still apply actually. But but all of that will largely be driven by some of the things we talked about earlier, which is being clear about what you want AI to do, what you want any component part of how you run the business to do, and recognizing not only its capabilities but its shortcomings and limitations as well.
And to actually adopt it responsibly.
Massively,
I do think that there's a huge topic about AI and the impact on culture, people's mental state, because there is a massive fear out there about, is this going to take my job? And so it's true, when something new comes in, no one likes change, and they tend to wrap their hands around their work and they don't want even to know about it. They're not going to be able to do that with AI.
Yeah, it is going to be a question. It is going to be a question, and it's probably a good segue because I talked to you before the call. I did say I was going to wave a book around at you, but it's called How to Think About AI by a chap called Richard Susskind, who most of his work is actually with the legal profession, but he's been working with machine learning and AI ever since it was first saw the light of day, probably 40 years ago. But in this book, recently published, he describes the defining challenge of our age as saving humanity with and from AI. And I think that's a really powerful statement, because AI is both the challenge and a large part of the solution. And I think that's a phrase that really resonated with me. I mean, I have read the whole book, but that was on the inside front cover, so luckily I got to that really quickly. But that really resonated with me to the extent where I actually emailed him afterwards, come on LinkedIn with him, and said, you have really got me with this. I love that phrase, because I think it just really captures the essence of what we're talking about here. That's something that is potentially a potential power for so much good that could also, I mean, I wouldn't be so apocalyptic as to say it could destroy us, but it could make our lives much worse in many ways if, to use your word, it's not applied responsibly. And that's at an individual, at a corporate, at a community, at a national, at a global level, which is definitely a subject for another podcast and probably with other people. But I think it's something we all have to have in our minds the whole time, because it's so powerful, potentially so powerful. It could do so much damage as well as so much good.
So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about what's next for AptumX. Where would you like to take your company over the next 6 to 12 months?
First big thing for us is securing our finance. Once it does, the first 6 to 12 months is pretty obvious, really. It's to get, we've done a couple of successful projects in the UK, but we haven't had the resources to really get established at any sort of scale. So it's become established. It's to get those first handful of customers. I don't mind who they are, but I think a sweet spot for us is working with organisations that are small enough that the founders or owners are probably still involved in some way, shape, or form. They're beginning to reach the point, which I can remember very well from my own experience, where you think, actually, I no longer can look around and go and chat to a few people or have a daily call with every member of the team and kind of know what's going on. And, I know if things are going well, it's only going to go in one direction. From here, it's going to get more difficult. So now's the time that I need to kind of systematize something that was in my head before. If we found ourselves working with between 5 and 10 companies like that over the next year, and if we were then able to really prove what I think is the key the key to our business model, which is not we'll turn up and sell you a piece of software and let's hope it all goes well. But we want to help, I want to use my experience of running growing companies. I want to use consulting experience of the sort of people that I would bring in. We want to help you to create the kind of organization that you want to create and to have a systems solution that is completely in sympathy and with and support of what you're trying to achieve, rather than, which is often the case when you get to the point of, say, implementing an ERP system, where you find that actually the system is working against you and it's making life more difficult. So it's kind of proving what I think is the real key to our proposition, which is, as I say, it's not just about selling a piece of software, it's about using that software to create actually a lot of the things we've been talking about in this discussion, create kind of culture. I'm not going to tell you what culture you want. I'm happy to engage in a conversation, but you will know what sort of culture you want. You will have a view really important about how you can use things like AI to your advantage. We'll make sure that you've got everything you need to make that AI actually work for you. So if in 12 months' time we were sitting here and saying, we've got the resources in place to start going out to the market properly, to start building our team in the UK, and we had a handful of customers who were well down that route, in a year you could do a lot. I mean, one of the great things about our software is you start getting benefits very, very quickly. So within a year's time, we should have a few champions who are saying this is really working for us, and then I think we could expand, quite quickly from there.
Absolutely. And tell me, what is your biggest challenge that you're facing in your business right now?
Biggest challenge right now, without question, is getting the financing across the line. Let's assume that happens, because I'm hopeful it will quite soon. I think our biggest challenge, but I don't mean this in terms of difficult, I just mean important, is going to be to get the right team together. Because what we're not is a sort of well-formed team of 5 or 6 people who are all doing everything for free until we can afford to pay ourselves. I know I've got a few people helping on a part-time basis. I think what combination of skills we need to recruit over the next year. I also know the first 2 or 3 people we bring in will have their own views, so we might change that view. It's going to be if we get the right people, and again, it goes back to, we haven't just flung this conversation together, have we? It goes back to something we talked about earlier. If we get the right people, then we'll do everything else right. We'll do the right structure, and we'll generate the right behaviours, and we'll have the right combination of skills. It's not necessarily easy to attract people into a startup, and that, in a way, that's why the financing is so important, because I need to be able to show people that we're here to stay and we've got the financial resources to make this work, and it's not going to fall over after 6 months. So I think, the biggest challenge, in a way, the biggest challenge is just getting going. But I think the biggest elements of that, apart from bringing in the finance, the biggest elements has got to be getting the right team. I think we know what we've got to do, but how we do it is so dependent upon having the right people working in the right way together.
And we spoke earlier about how critical it is to hire the right person, because you can always teach skill set, but it's to have that attitude and the right charisma and the right cultural fit.
I mean, that is almost word for word what I spent, all the years in our first business saying to everybody. We can exactly that. There's some things you can teach. There's some things that you've either got or you haven't.
So if you had to solve one issue right now, like a click of a finger, what would it be?
Well, for our business,
Yeah.
Getting our financing across the line, without question.
Money in the bank overnight.
Yeah, I mean, because there's things you can't do without financial resources. Yeah, without question. So I'm hoping by the time this goes out, we might have solved that, because we are quite close. But it's the last bit that always takes the longest. So, we're still working on that. So
80-20 rule, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for giving us such a clear picture of everything we discussed today. It was very, very.
I really enjoyed it.
And before we wrap up, is there one piece of advice you would give to other transformation leaders trying to measure impact more meaningfully?
Without sounding trite or repeating things they've already heard, I think, because it's been my bugbear forever, I think it has been, think about how you can affect the shift from transformation as a project to change transformation as a day-to-day business as usual capability mindset in your organization, because it may not help you on today's project, but it won't half help you in the future. Because if you move from a situation where every change is a mountain that's got to be climbed to change is just recognized as the reality, which it is in any organization, then you will find it much easier to take people. Well, I was going to say to take people with you, but actually I think the whole point is it shouldn't be about taking people with you, because that sort of implies you're doing it to them. It's about creating an environment where people recognize that change is a good thing, and an inevitable thing, and therefore it doesn't have to get wrapped up in a project to be dealt with, because it's just something that's acknowledged day to day. I think many organizations are far more in that space now than they were 10 or 20 years ago, but I also think it's a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they embrace it, they're going to adopt it for sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Listeners would like to learn more about AptumX and connect with yourself. Where's the best place to do that?
Website www.aptumx, that's aptumx.com. And I'll give you the info because it's easier than spelling out my name, but info@aptumx.com.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. It's been absolutely
really interesting.